all we have now is mentorship. It'd be nice to actually put that as part of the curriculum for residents who are starting. How do you develop a good balance in your life and the importance of balance? I mean, and it takes on different forms as your career matures, you know.
Welcome to EyeCan, a podcast about ophthalmology through a uniquely Canadian lens with Hadi Saheb and myself, Heather O'Donnell. Season 5 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. We thank them for their support.
La saison 5 du balado EyeCan vous est offerte par Bayer. Nous les remercions pour leur soutien. We will be sharing our experiences as ophthalmologists today and tackle some of the challenges we face as healthcare providers. Dr. Allan Slomovic is the University Health Network, Marta and Owen Boris Endowed Chair in Cornea and Stem Cell Research, as well as Research Director of the Cornea External Disease Service at Toronto Western Hospital. He is the past president of the Canadian Ophthalmological Society and current co-chair of the Canadian Ocular Regenerative Society. As well as being a leader in cornea and external disease treatment, Dr. Slomovic has trained scores of residents and fellows from all over the world, including Canada, the US, Israel, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Great Britain. In 2001, he was awarded the Mentor of the Year Award by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He was also awarded the Clive Mortimer Fellowship Award in June 2024 for his work with the fellows and has been nominated one of Toronto's top doctors for the 4th consecutive year by City Post. Dr. Slomovic is co-founder of an annual teaching and surgical mission to Costa Rica, and he has published numerous articles in cornea external diseases of the eye and refractive surgery, and has also lectured on these topics locally, nationally, and internationally.
Dr. Brian Ballios is a fellowship-trained clinician scientist specializing in medical and inherited retinal diseases. He is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Department of Ophthalmology and Vision Sciences, holding the J. Ardith Hill Fighting Blindness Canada Professorship in Ocular Genetics Research. Dr. Ballios is a clinician scientist at the University Health Network's Donald K. Johnson Eye Institute, director of its clinical research unit, and staff physician at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre and Kensington Vision and Research Centre, where he also leads clinical electrophysiology. He completed his MD PhD at the University of Toronto with a background in engineering chemistry from Queen's University. His research focuses on inherited retinal disorders and stem cell-based therapies. After his ophthalmology residency at the University of Toronto, he pursued fellowship in inherited retinal disease at Mass Eye and Ear at Harvard University. Dr. Ballios receives peer-reviewed funding from Fighting Blindness Canada, the Foundation Fighting Blindness US, the Usher 1F Collaborative, the Gans Family Foundation, and the Orphan Disease Center. Dr. Slomovic and Dr. Ballios, welcome to EyeCan. We're excited to have you join us. Let's get started.
So I'd like to start with a question for you, Allan. And regenerative ophthalmology seems to be a topic that's getting more and more attention. And so I'd love to hear from you what you feel are the most promising developments in ocular regenerative medicine today, and how do you feel Canada is a part of that advancement for this field?
Ocular stem cell disease is not a common disease. It's not like something that is practiced at every hospital or even at every teaching hospital across the country. There are centers of excellence throughout Canada. For example, we started about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. We combined with the renal transplant service to develop a very strong stem cell program where the renal transplant service brought in excellence in immunosuppression and following these patients with very complex medical regimens. I also went to India to learn from the master a new type of stem cell surgery called simple limbal epithelial transplantation, and we've published quite a bit on this. The one thing it isn't is simple, although it's called that. The Indians are great with procedures, but maybe not so good with nomenclature. So, in Montreal, in your hometown, Hadi, we've got some really strong people in this area. We've got Isabelle Brunet, who I believe is going to be having an international stem cell meeting at the Université de Montréal. And we also have Mona Dagger, who's the current president of the Canadian Ophthalmological Society. And she's a world expert. She just spoke at the World Cornea Congress last week in Washington on Boston keratoplasties, which is a artificial cornea. We also have another center of real excellence in Laval, where you have Lucie Germain, who's a PhD, who's doing some fabulous work with cultured corneal stem cells. The concept here, and we've done one of these, is you take a very small piece of tissue. That's the benefit. You don't need a lot of stem cells from either the same eye or from the other eye. So there's less risk that you could be pushing the eye into a problem if you take less tissue. And she cultures these, and after about 2 months or so, she sends them back to you on a matrix that you can just transplant onto a patient with disease, stem cell disease. And I think probably the other area of excellence would be in Vancouver with Sonia Young, who was my former fellow. We went to India together to learn simple limbal epithelial transplantation. And Greg Maloney, who's a recent recruit. Putting this all together, we have a national society at the Canadian Ophthalmological Society, the Canadian Ocular Regenerative Medicine Society. Brian has been our guest on several occasions, talking about stem cell disease, gene therapy as it relates to the retina. And we've had the world's leading experts speak at this meeting, and it really gives Canadians a chance to get together and share their knowledge and disseminate good information.
Amazing. And so for you, Alan, as a anterior segment specialist, what is the typical patients that's benefiting from this expertise in your clinic?
Okay, so I'll tell you about the first patient, which because of this patient, I received my chair in stem cell research. The common symptoms are blindness and pain. They get blindness because the surface, the epithelium, becomes hazy, it becomes vascularized. The clear cornea then gets covered with conjunctival tissue. And what happens is, so that causes the blindness, and that because of the nature of this tissue, you get frequent erosions and abrasions, and that causes quite a bit of pain on a fairly regular basis. So with my patient, he presented, he was a young college student, and he was living in his basement in darkness and was just hanging on by his fingernails to, he put the font up for his studies. He was at McMaster. Anyways, this was a very unusual case. It just went extremely well. 1 month after his stem cell transplant, his sister was a donor from Vancouver, and she came in for that. And 1 month afterwards, he was driving a car and was pain free. So, not all, it doesn't all go like this, but it has the potential to do that in the best case scenario.
Thanks for that. Dr. Ballios, hi. Can you tell us a bit about the latest advancements in stem cell-based treatments for retinal diseases like AMD and inherited retinal dystrophies?
Sure. So again, thanks for having me on. The state of stem cell therapy for the retina stands at a really, I think, important crossroads at this time. The conditions that stem cell therapy is looking to treat are some of the most challenging conditions in retina, the conditions where patients inexorably lose light sensitive cells. And in conditions like AMD and in many of the inherited retinal disorders, there are not options to regenerate vision. We've been immensely fortunate in aspects of AMD to have drugs for wet macular degeneration, like anti-VEGF therapies that can help to stabilize disorders. But they don't really represent a way to restore vision that's lost because of the loss of light sensitive cells. And that's really the goal of stem cell therapy in the retina. The earliest approaches over the last 15 years or so have seen us try to transplant undifferentiated stem cells. That is stem cells underneath the retina, right next to the light sensitive cells, to try to replace those light sensitive cells or the pigmented epithelium, the retinal pigment epithelium that sits underneath. And perhaps naively so, most of those approaches have involved putting those undifferentiated stem cells next to those cells. And with, I would say, only mild to modest success at replacing those cells, it seems perhaps a bit naive to think that those stem cells would know what to do in that space. Some of them certainly turn into photoreceptors. Some of them turn into RPE cells. There's some lovely studies showing that you can transplant stem cells underneath and form new retinal pigment epithelium. And yet the boosts in vision that we would have hoped for those patients have not yet been achieved through those clinical studies. And what we stand now on the threshold of is a revolution in stem cell biology for retinal disorders, where we are using those stem cells rather than transplanting them in an undifferentiated fashion. Most of the current clinical trials are using the differentiated stem cells. So we've made light-sensitive photoreceptors from those stem cells or differentiated RPE sheets. And there's a number of collaborative efforts across the world, including investigators in Canada, to transplant these differentiated cells underneath the retina. A great example recently that's really exciting, that was just announced about 2 weeks ago, was a Canadian company that was founded in part in Canada called Blue Rock Therapeutics. And Blue Rock Therapeutics just achieved orphan drug status approval of the FDA for a new stem cell-based photoreceptor replacement clinical trial that they hope to launch later in Q4 of 2025 to try to replace photoreceptors in patients who are suffering from some of the most severe causes of retinal vision loss. And in inherited retinal disorders, these are conditions we call cone rod dystrophies. These patients lose the vast majority of their cone and rod photoreceptors, and it results in legal blindness. These patients are immensely visually disabled, and they really have no option for treatment at all. And the current approaches to gene therapy, for example, to try to salvage the remaining photoreceptors, don't really serve those patients who've lost the vast majority of those photoreceptors from these very severe diseases. And so Blue Rock is planning to launch a clinical trial to support the transplantation of photoreceptors in these patients. This is based on science that's been done through some of my own work at U of T in collaboration with others in the US. It's all based on publications of collaborative work we've worked on together. So I think in this field in stem cell biology, like I said, we're standing at the threshold of a new era in stem cell efforts for regenerative medicine.
You know, it's interesting. It used to be, having been around for a while, I've seen the perspective of the disease. And it used to be wet macular degeneration was terrible. And now we have treatment for it. We have anti-VEGF. And now it's the dry macular degeneration, which was the better one, which was the good cousin, is now the bad cousin. So, but it's really, you know, we're lucky to have people like you on the frontiers pushing this forward. And I'm sure that it'll come. It's just a matter of time.
Well, you're right, Alan. I mean, these drugs that we have now are amazing and give us incredible optimism for what a patient can achieve. But even my patients who have wet macular that we're able to stabilize with the anti-VEGF medications, if you watch them over years, that dry disease is still progressing in the background. And you know, when you follow them over short periods of time, they're happy to know that their retina is stable. And yet they think back to 2 or 3 years ago when they started to see you and they say, right, but it's not the same as it was when you first got me back there. It's been changing. And those are the things that, you know, those are the big picture problems that we want to try to help those patients with. But you're right. I mean, the options we have now in pharmacotherapy is amazing, but stem cells is the promise of regeneration.
Do you find the conversation? I do want to ask you more about kind of the technology of this, but let's talk for just a minute, if we can, about like the idea of hope and the way that we communicate with our patients. I think this conversation is so exciting because it really, I think it shifts how the messaging that we're able to give to these patients with devastating diseases. And while it remains critically important to be real with patients about, you know, what severe vision loss means and how we can support them through the journey of loss of function, I think there's something about hope in here that matters a great deal.
Heather, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, as physicians, we may not be able to treat everybody, but we certainly can give everybody hope. And we can say that. I mean, there's research, you know, and you can see that the research is on a precipice, that conditions like stem cell disease was not treatable, both for the cornea or for the retina years ago when I started. Now it is. I mean, we're making progress. So I think hope is essential. Hope runs eternal. And I think it's our job as physicians to care not only for the body, but for their minds too.
Totally.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hope is such an important part of the conversation. For my patients with rare genetic retinal disorders, we've done some studies. We published this in the Ophthalmology journal just earlier this year. The diagnostic odyssey is immense. I mean, some of these patients have seen 3, 4, 5 different specialist providers before they come to find a diagnosis, an accurate diagnosis for their condition. And when they get that diagnosis, there's a moment of achievement and elation. And then it follows sometimes quickly by the impression that there's no therapy to give them off the shelf. There's no magic prescription pad that you can give to them. And you can see the crest falling, right? You can see that. And for them to learn about the different studies that we're doing at my institution or elsewhere in Canada, and stem cell therapies or gene therapies, regenerative medicine strategies, I mean, this gives an immense amount of hope that someone is, and a group of people are working very hard to find solutions to their disorder.
Thank you for that. Let's dive in a little bit to just a little bit more about the technology. Can you explain the gene editing technology with respect to CRISPR? I think can you give our listeners like a little 411 on this? Like, what exactly does this mean? How can we think about this? If I have to explain, if my patient comes in and I have to explain it to them, what should I tell them?
Yeah, so when I talk to patients about genetic disorders that might be amenable to gene therapy, first I usually explain to them what a gene is. I mean, DNA is a code, right? It's a code, a blueprint that sets out how our cells can make the proteins that are important for how our body works and how our eyes work. And our DNA is divided up into, you could think of it like a large library full of books. And these books are different genes. And each book, each gene tells our body how to make a protein. And there's a collection of books. There's a section of the library important for the retina. And we think about 350 genes, maybe some more, but we've discovered about 350 of them that we know are essential for how the retina works. And within these books, there could be various misspellings. Just like any book, sometimes a misspelling is somewhat benign. You read a book and you see a typo and it doesn't change the meaning of the word, or meaning of the book. But if you read a book and there's a transposition, instead of the main character being named Tom, his name is Tim, I mean, it changes the entire impression of the book. A simple misspelling can change the entire meaning. These are pathogenic mutations. So one of the goals of gene therapy in the case of CRISPR gene editing is to say, well, could we actually go in with a molecular whiteout and go in and white out those areas where the misspelling is occurring and actually write in the correct spelling and change the meaning of the book back to what it is. And sometimes it's just a single word can change the entire meaning. Could we go in specifically and change that word? And so CRISPR is a tool for that. There's been a number of tools developed over the years, but CRISPR is the latest tool that seems to work very specifically as an editor to go into the book and cut out that word and paste in another word. And so that's the simple way or a simple analogy, I hope simple, that I try to explain to patients about how it works. And so the exciting thing is the eye has been the proving ground for using CRISPR gene therapy. It's been the first place that CRISPR was ever applied in a living person to try to do gene editing in Leber congenital amaurosis, a very severe form of vision loss caused by mutations in genes. And I was immensely gratified to be part of those early clinical trials. And it was magical to write a prescription in a clinical trial for a CRISPR gene therapy. I mean, this is a technology that won a Nobel Prize, right, for Jennifer Doudna. And this was an incredible achievement in science, and to write that sort of prescription for a patient, it's quite remarkable.
I bet.
So that's how it works in a nutshell.
What a gift your description is to our listeners and to clinicians that log into this podcast, because I think that's a fantastic, I haven't heard that exact analogy and metaphor before, and I really appreciate it.
Well, we're all cobbled together from our mentors, and I have to give some credit to Dr. Eric Pierce at Mass Eye and Ear at Harvard. If he does ever tune into this podcast, he did once explain to a patient that a gene was like a large book. And I've just extended that analogy to talk about libraries and misspellings and Tim and Tom. But we're all pieces of people we learn from.
Tell us, it's so true. Tell us about the Canadian context a bit. What are the key research advances and companies that are advancing bioengineered tissues? And tell us what the key challenges are. Is it regulatory? Is it commercialization challenges? What are you coming up against?
So in the context of bioengineering and tissue transplantation, I mean, I think one of the largest challenges that we've encountered in applying stem cell therapies is that stem cells can't work in isolation, just as none of our cells can work in isolation in a tissue. They need a matrix, and they need a platform on which to live and survive. There's a biological concept called anoikis. This is the concept that a cell in isolation without a tissue around it to support it ultimately undergoes programmed cell death called apoptosis. And without a matrix around it, it won't survive. We've seen that in the earliest efforts of stem cell therapies in the late 90s and early 2000s, that injections of cells in the absence of a matrix, the survival rates of these cells are very, very low. And so many efforts have been made to try to develop these matrices to grow cells on. Some of them are to support their organization and survival. Great examples would be some of the injectable hydrogel work that I had done in collaboration with individuals like Dr. Molly Shoyket, university professor and researcher at the University of Toronto. Dr. May Griffith out of Montreal had done some work on this in the context of cornea. I'm sure Allan can speak more to that. There's a variety of different researchers looking to use biomaterials to organize cells into the structures that we would typically see in the living tissue to act as a scaffold for transplantation. In the context of the retina, the best examples are in the transplantation of retinal pigment epithelium. This is a monolayer of cells. They won't know how to organize themselves by themselves. And so they need to be laid out on a tissue scaffold for transplantation. And we've seen a number of clinical efforts and publications in major journals like The Lancet and Nature Biotechnology highlighting these approaches. And that technology, in many cases, is born out of collaborations with Canadian scientists.
From a cornea point of view, you have a tissue that's about this as thick as a quarter, and you've got stem cell treatment for the front of the cornea, and you got stem cell treatment for the back of the cornea. And who would have thought that so much could go into such a small tissue? But it's the only tissue in the body that's clear. And if you cloud the cornea, you're not going to see well, and you'll have pain if you have stem cell disease in the front of the eye. So with respect to the front of the eye, stem cell transplantation, there's some really good work coming out of Laval University, which we are a part of at the Don Johnson Eye Institute. Both Clara Chan and myself, we have been doing, what Lucy Germain does is she will grow these stem cells, which are pluripotent cells, and she'll grow them ex vivo, and then put them on a matrix, which Brian was talking about, and then she sends you this tissue. She actually came herself just to make sure the tissue went well. And that was a bit of an experience, she told me, going on the plane, asking if you had anything to declare. But she brought it herself, and it was transplanted. And as I mentioned at the beginning, only a very small piece of tissue is required. It's less invasive. On the other side of the coin, on the endothelium, a lot of work is being done on multiplying stem cells in vivo. There's a tremendous corneal blindness is probably the most common cause of blindness in the world today. And there's a tremendous shortage of corneal tissue. So what they're doing now is it was thought that the endothelial cells, which are the back layer of the cornea, which are responsible for keeping the cornea dehydrated and clear, that they couldn't multiply. Yet we are finding ways to multiply it so you can get one cornea supplying tissue for 100 people. And currently research, and in Toronto it's being done as well, is being done implanting or injecting this corneal tissue to treat corneal decompensation, which is one of the commonest cause of corneal blindness. So a lot of research is being done. The obstacles there, and May Griffith, who Brian mentioned, I'm doing some work with her right now. And this is an example of the difficulty. She's got a great project with international collaboration, and getting money to fund this is being difficult. The other major difficult, which Brian and I were talking about earlier today, is do we really need a separate regulatory body in Canada and in the United States? Maybe we can just, charge tariffs and get away with it. Just kidding. But maybe we could just get a little bit better communication between our regulatory bodies, Health Canada and the FDA. I think that, our standards are very similar. And with proper communication, the goals can be unified. And that would, it costs so much to get a new drug commercialized. And it should, because you need to have due diligence. but we don't need to do that 2 or 3 or 4 times. With better communication, I think the ability to move a lot of these important steps forward would cost a lot less money, and it would take a lot less time, and it would allow people like Brian and myself to do what we do best and not fill out all these forms and grants and all this. So I think, to me, that's been an obstacle. Just getting my stem cell program approved took me about 3 years.
Wow.
And then to get the Boston K-Pro, which is part of the stem cell program, that took another 2 years. So it shouldn't take that long, and it takes up my time, which would be better spent doing surgery or doing stem cell transplants rather than writing grants. Our hospitals have been very helpful, but it's been an obstacle getting it approved by the regulatory bodies. And maybe it could be better communication between us and Europe and the United States would simplify matters and make it a lot easier.
Would you think almost that the international collaboration that went into the monstrous efforts around the COVID vaccination, that we managed to work so collaboratively internationally at that time, that maybe it would have pushed forward this idea that, hey, look, when we do team up against a unified challenge, we do very well and can really advance things. But it sounds to me like maybe we didn't actually manage to extract all the learning from that we could or should have.
Heather, you make an excellent point. Necessity is the mother of invention. I'm going to make a comment. I'm not. This is not a political comment, but we had Project Warp Speed, I believe it was called, and the vaccinations just became available. It cut through all the red tape, and that saved lives. And we could be saving eyeballs if we had maybe better communication and better processes to get good ideas from the bench to the bedside.
Yeah. Brian, I can tell you want to make a comment there. What do you
I was
think?
just gonna echo some of that and say, these there's the idea of these grand challenges, and that we need to maybe consolidate efforts around grand challenges. And it's hard in a world and a system where there's so many important healthcare challenges to address. I mean, for the world to come together in an unprecedented way to fight COVID and develop vaccines, you imagine if everyone came together for one of these disorders that one of my patients has, like Usher syndrome or something, and they put their efforts, how quickly we could move the yardstick. But it's hard to imagine coming together all on this one front. But some places have tried to make that effort. And some research institutes have tried to set what they call audacious goals and audacious goal initiatives to bring together collaborators from both sides, from discovery science and from clinical application, to try to address the most monstrous challenges in our field, and to some great success. But it takes effort, and it takes a certain amount of funding and money, and I think that that's a big challenge. And then from the regulatory side, as Allan was saying, there's this gap, right? You have brilliant, talented researchers around the world, and in Canada, we have a wealth of stem cell biologists, regenerative medicine biologists for cornea and for retina. They're doing amazing work, and they are discovering new approaches, new biology, and new potential therapeutics. They are looking to discover these things, but they also need to fund their research programs to make more of these discoveries. Then you have our clinicians who want to apply these to the patients, right? In between this, there's a massive amount of development that needs to go into a therapy. Issues around scale, a good manufacturing process, checking off cytotoxicity and toxicology and pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetic studies that need to be done. But it's not your basic scientists who are discovering things that are not going to put their grant monies and efforts into that. They're looking for new therapies. It's not your clinicians who are applying these therapies who are going to reach back and say they want to do this development. There's a gap there. And I think we need to find better ways of partnering our government organizations who do funding together with our pharma companies who see the potential brilliance in these approaches to help get those drugs across, because there's some very promising therapies that need to cross that valley. And I just would add that as a way where we could rethink how we bring things to market.
I think what we're saying is we need to be a startup nation, and we need to have that infrastructure help. Because as a clinician, I'm not a basic scientist. Brian is. I think he's doing great great research, but that's not where our energy should be directed. There needs to be some infrastructure to help us move the art posts. And I think Startup Nation, it would be great if Canada could start a little bit more like that.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
I'm Lauren Dalvin, and I listen to the EyeCan podcast.
I'd like to follow up with a question about, some of the, you've touched on it a little bit, but if we can elaborate a little bit more on some of the ethical considerations with bringing, these treatments to clinical practice here in Canada.
There is the ethical question. Because there's so much bureaucracy, what happens is we go to third world countries to try this out. And that brings up a whole bunch of ethical questions. Is it really okay to do in a country which does not have the same standards to prove that our science is working? I think that's always been an issue. But there are other issues too. These are, the issue of privacy, the issue of getting the appropriate consent, because a lot of these treatments are new. So I think that fortunately, most of the academic centers have research ethic boards, and it's evaluated by experts in the field at a bit of arm's length. Takes a long time turnaround. I don't know what it's like at McGill or out west, but I know at our university, they're trying to improve it, and they have improved it, but it still takes time to get our ethics approval.
I think I agree with everything that Allan said. One of the other things I think about in the rare disease space is one of the other ethical principles of justice. And this is, some of these new therapies are coming with very large ticket prices. For example, some of the new gene therapies might cost $1 million per dose. And in our Canadian healthcare system, who's going to bear the cost of those actual therapies? And, it's our public healthcare system. And I think back to the time when Voretigene Naparvovec, which is known by its brand name as Luxturna, was being approved for RP65 disease. This is perhaps for a single dose, the most expensive drug in all of ophthalmology, $1 million to treat both eyes of a patient. Now it's a once in a lifetime dose in principle, but this is a huge amount of money for our taxpayers across the country to bear, and so that was a point of some difficulty, right? Getting that point across. So it wasn't just the regulatory approval and looking at the approval based on evidence. It was also a large discussion for well over a year about how was funding actually going to work, and what if a patient who was in a province that didn't have a provider who could apply the therapy needed to travel to another province to apply the therapy? Was that province then going to bill back to the home province $1 million as invoice them? These were huge questions that the public funding agencies had to deal with, and having that suddenly thrust onto their lap to have to deal with it caused a huge slowdown in approval. I think we need to be more nimble and recognize that some of these therapies are going to be expensive. Some of them are going to be life-changing. We have to have ways of dealing with that concept as well, because while patients are waiting for approval of those therapies, they're losing vision, they're losing cells. And those who have the means will sometimes travel to other places to try to get a therapy. Those who don't can't. And in the case of Luxturna, a great example, a patient who launched a Kickstarter fund to raise the $1 million to go to another country and receive the therapy because it wasn't yet approved and not funded in Canada. this raises issues around healthcare disparity between different populations and patient groups. So I think that's an important thing we have to keep in mind.
And it also brings up the issue of medical tourism, going to other countries and who looks after the patient afterwards. We've had that happen several times for people. And what about if it's not approved therapy? We've had several patients go to other countries like South America to get implants to change their iris color. And basically, they ended up with destruction of their cornea, their uveitis, glaucoma, and who picks up the bill for that, for that kind of treatment? So I think both those issues about cost and medical tourism are really important ethical issues.
It certainly raises the question of like where in our system. I think there isn't a healthcare provider that I have met in the last 5 years, I would say, and certainly in the last 2, that doesn't describe some degree of frustration, anxiety, and burnout around their job and the amount of work that they're doing, in the sense that the system is kind of crumbling or falling apart. And even in this context and being involved in this podcast and all of these exciting discussions, it is really this constant to and fro of amazing things that you can get excited about, and then how do you grapple and balance this idea that, gosh, things are also really, really challenging. And I think there's probably some teeter in the middle that does allow us to actually gain some hope, find some efficiencies, draw on the collective skill sets of whether it's combinations of collaboration and improved governance, improved processes, and a willingness of everybody to stay engaged. It becomes so critical.
Heather, it's an important point, and that's balance in your life. And I think being involved with education throughout my career, I think that's really an important. All we have now is mentorship. It'd be nice to actually put that as part of the curriculum for residents who are starting. How do you develop a good balance in your life, and the importance of balance? I mean, and it takes on different forms as your career matures. You're starting off, you have a young family, then kids, then they go to school. And how do you develop that balance? And I think that's an important thing to transmit onto the next generation. They're all bright and energetic, but you've got to know what we have to be able to teach priorities as well, and how to find that balance in their lives. I think they become even more productive when they do have that balance.
Well, I can't help myself but jump ahead and ask a really important question that we like to ask everybody when they come on the EyeCan podcast, which is, tell us about how you strike balance, and what are the things you do outside of, I'm going to ask both of you this. I also need to ask you the magic wand question, which is like, if you could wave a magic wand in the context of ocular regenerative medicine, what would you do? But then tell me, like, also, I'm kind of, if you can't hear it in my voice, guys, I'm like dying for the answer to your question of how you achieve that balance, because that is not a lecture that I'm giving this year. That is for sure. So if you have the magic answer for all of us, we're all waiting with bated breath here to hear what it is.
Well, Heather, I think it starts off by there's no silver bullet for everybody. As I said, it changes with time and with your circumstances throughout your profession. What I found important, and my North Star, is trying to think about what are my priorities. My family's always come first. So work is a close second. Like friends and family, I guess, would be first, and work is a close second. So I know if there's conflict, I know what I have to do. And when residents come to me with conflict, and I was program director for 2 terms, for actually 11 years, and I've seen everything from drug abuse to alcohol to spousal abuse. And a lot of that comes from not having the right balance in your life. I think you've got to, knowing what your priorities are important, but also trying to give yourself some time. A very wise man once, he was a businessman, and he told me, you save your time for your clients, and that we all get, but you got to save some time for yourself and sell it to yourself. And whether you're a professional or a businessman or whatever, I think that's a good principle to move forward with.
Well, it's hard to add much to that. I think I fall in first, I guess I would say I'm no longer convinced that there's such a thing as true balance. I think anyone who's obsessed with the things that they do is always going to be drawn down to the things that they do. But I think there's a place you have to find a happiness, and whatever works for you. I don't think there's a magic formula for balance that applies to everybody. But I think I fall into that camp as a father of a young one who's a baby now, only 18 months, and so I find family immensely centering. And I think as time's gone on, I think I realize one of the most important thing is to just as we all try to be gentle and understanding with our patients, I think we need to be gentle and understanding with ourselves and our loved ones around us, so that can be reciprocated. And when we're obsessive people as we are in the things that we do in our careers and trying to help our patients, I think many physicians are immensely obsessive about the things that they do. They're motivated to bring therapy and care to their patients. I think it sometimes comes in the face of self neglect in some cases, right? And self-love is not so great a sin as self-neglect, right? Wasn't that Henry V? I think it's important to remember that you need to be as gentle with yourself as you try to be with your patients and understanding. And I think if you apply that principle, maybe you're getting closer to balance, or whatever that's supposed to mean.
I like it. One of my mentors in medical school, I remember him saying, when I told him, I really struggle to say no. Somebody asks me for something, you have the lovely, charming Hattie Saheb says to you, "Hey, Heather, do you want to co-host this season of the EyeCan podcast?" It's hard to say no. But the language that I was given by this physician was, you don't have to say no. Just start with saying, "I'm not sure the timing's right." And it will buy you enough time to think about saying no. And then maybe you'll get a bit better at it. But it's still not a skill that I have. And Hattie,
Heather,
do you
I
know
think
any
that's
big
exactly
tricks
what
to
you
let...
said when I asked you if you wanted to co-host this with me. And I think I just pretended like I didn't hear that. And I just said, "Hey, so you want to start in a month?" And you eventually said yes. So, but you started with that. So that's a good one, which is actually true, right? Even if you're excited about something, it doesn't mean it's the right time all the time. So I love the direction this conversation has taken. I do think Heather, and I know our listeners would love to hear when we were talking about the magic wand. I think you took the magic wand on balance, which I love. We also want to know what your magic wand wants to do on this topic of ocular regenerative therapy. So for both of you, is there, if you had a magic wand and you can do something to make this field go forward, what would your kind of dream be for this field?
Well, I think Heather kind of touched on in some of her comments. Creating a unified approach to driving forward a particular goal in regenerative medicine, in the way that people got together to work on a grand challenge like COVID. That's a magic formula. I mean, I think that one of the issues we have is there's so many silos at our institutions, at our research institutions. We all have separate research ethics boards. We all have separate mechanisms of institutional approval. If we could break down those regulatory silos, if we could unify and streamline that process, I mean, that would cut so much work away from the business of having to do discovery, that we could focus on pure discovery and implementation. And I think a global effort was done to do that for COVID, because people recognized the intense morbidity and mortality that was being suffered on the scale of millions and millions of people. And true, that may not be the case for every single one of the disorders we focus on, but if we could take our time to focus on these grand challenges and break down things, I would wave my wand and get rid of all these siloed ethics board and approval systems, unify these so that we could, in principle, all of these different boards for approval have this, they execute the same ethical principles, right? To try to bring things forward. They're siloed into different committees and organizations, but they're all applying the same principles. So I don't know why we shouldn't just wave a wand and do away with all of that and have one centralized thing. And it's a bit magical, but you're asking about magical thinking. So
from my perspective, it's sort of follows somewhat from what Brian was just saying. It's collaboration. I've always found that I've learned the most from other people, other services, other subspecialties. You know, combining and collaborating with the renal transplant service made a big difference for our stem cell program. They brought an expertise that would take me forever to learn, and it would never be as good. And so I think that kind of collaboration between different subspecialties, different centers of excellence is, I think, an important metric of moving the dial forward.
And the other thing I want to touch on before we wrap up, and this is a question for you, Brian. You had mentioned hope for your patients, and how sometimes after getting the diagnosis and being excited about the diagnosis, they start losing hope a little bit because they feel their condition doesn't have a clear treatment. So what is your current spiel to your patients after you meet them and tell them, well, right now, there's some optimization stuff we can do, but there's not necessarily a cure for your condition. How are you leaving them with hope? What's your spiel?
It's hard to think of a spiel because my patients all have very unique disorders and it's a very heterogeneous population. I mean, we focus on, it's so natural when a patient comes in to focus on the things that are missing or difficult about their vision. In the case of my patients with retinitis pigmentosa, for example, it's their side vision and their night vision. Oh, I can't see the side. I'm bumping into people. And I think they forget to focus on the things that are very strong about their vision, the positive aspects, the strong central acuity that they have and that they're likely to retain for years, decades, even after their diagnosis. For some of my macular dystrophy patients or patients with age-related macular degeneration, for example, yes, they will have challenges reading and this is very upsetting, but they're also going to retain visual independence with their healthy side vision as their life goes on. And I think for those patients to know that there's parts of their vision that are going to be strong and continue to be strong in the future, and that the lights are not going to go out, but that they're going to retain an ability to either be visually independent or have strong aspects of their vision, I think this also imbues them with an immense amount of hope for the future. So we talk about the things and we acknowledge the things that are difficult. We also talk about the things that are very good about their vision and hopefully in some cases likely to remain so. But then when we come to talking outside of prognosis about therapy, and yes, as you said, they can be discouraged by the absence of a prescription, take 2 of these and your condition goes away. I think they're immensely encouraged to know that there's a large number of people, myself and others that we know of across Canada, around the world, that are working hard on these problems, that are making advances. They like to know what those advances are, how those advances are tangibly being brought to patients. And they like to know that we're communicating with each other. I think one of the greatest fears of patients is that on their journey, they've been very isolated. So they imagine that we are not communicating with each other as physicians, that you have to go find the secret doctor who's working somewhere in some corner in the country who has the answer for you, who actually possesses the silver bullet. But I think when they find out that we're talking to each other all the time about the advances in regenerative medicine in this space, I think they feel immensely reassured that it's a group of people who are well connected to each other. The world has shrunk immensely, and in many ways, I can reassure my patients that I don't think we're going to miss something very important that just came out of somewhere else in North America or in Europe or in Japan or in Australia. That we're going to hear about this and find ways to connect them to those advances. So I think the idea of connectedness is very helpful for these patients. They've been on an isolated journey, and to hear that, I think, fills them with hope that it's not just people working all alone in isolation.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for participating in our podcast. It was a wonderful conversation. We're so grateful that you were willing to join us tonight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We look forward to bringing you more engaging content over the coming months. EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca. et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
Season 5 of the EyeCan podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. We thank them for their support.
La saison 5 du balado EyeCan vous est offerte par Bayer. Nous les remercions pour leur soutien.
Thank you from the Canadian Ophthalmological Society. EyeCan is available wherever you listen to your podcasts and, of course, through the COS Practice Resource Center.
EyeCan est disponible partout où vous écoutez vos balados et bien sûr au Centre de ressources pour la pratique de la SCO.
EyeCan is written and directed by Kim Teitler and produced by John Allaire from Allaire Strategic Works.
EyeCan est écrit et réalisé par Kim Teitler et produit par John Allaire d'Allaire Strategic Works. Some episodes this season will include relevant links and show notes, so be sure to check episode descriptions to learn more. Certains épisodes de cette saison incluront des liens pertinents dans les notes d'émission, alors n'oubliez pas de consulter les descriptions des épisodes pour en savoir plus.
If any of our listeners have topic ideas to submit, please email them to communications@cos-sco.ca and we will review for consideration.